Last episode, we talked about the Meadowcroft rock shelter and the early humans who crossed the Bering Strait by sea, by land, or through an ice free land corridor over the Bering Strait and into Canada. This migration occurred from anywhere between 25,000 years ago to 18,000 years ago, the first peopling of the Americas. The Meadowcroft rock shelter, or rock shelter in Avella, western Pennsylvania, was used by these early humans, according to the archaeological data, at least 18,000 years ago and maybe even further back. Today, we will go into more detail about the people who lived in and used the rock shelter. Those people are part of a historical period in the Americas from 18,000 to 10,000 years ago, a period of time referred to as the Lithic period or the Paleo Indian period. We will also cover the historical period right after the Paleo Indian period, the early Archaic, which covers 10,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago in North America. Welcome, everybody, to the History of Pittsburgh podcast. Remember, I told you this would be a deep dive into the history of Pittsburgh, and I meant it. We're diving into the entire history of Pittsburgh, as far back as Pangea, all the way up to modern times. So if you like my content, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. My name is Joe Palmetto. I'm a native Pittsburgher, born and raised. Except for the 4 years that I was in the Air Force, I've lived in Pittsburgh my entire life. If you enjoy this content, I'm asking you to support this show for free. First and foremost, I need subscribers. Please subscribe to the show. Also, drop a like and a comment. Further boost my channel. Additionally, I've started a Patreon. I have 3 kids at home, a full-time job. I love making this podcast, but it costs me time, and time is money. If you love my content, check out my Patreon. It's in the description below. Just $4 a month will unlock great additional content for you. Now, back to the episode. So, the ancient history of the Americas is broken up into several distinct periods. First, you have the Lithic or Paleo-Indian period, which runs from about 18,000 to 10,000 years ago. After that, there is the Archaic period, which runs from 10,000 years ago to about 3,000 years ago. This period, the Archaic, can be divided into the first half, the early Archaic, and into the late Archaic or transition period. About 3,000 years ago, the post-Archaic or woodland period begins. And this is an interesting period. I'm also a big fan of the name, the woodland period. This is when what we know about Native American cultures becomes more recognizable to us. The woodland period is from 3,000 years ago, or about 1,000 BC, and technically runs into modern times. But it is further broken down into the formative period, 1000 BC to 500 AD. Then the classic period from 500 AD to 1200 AD. And finally, the post-classic period, which runs from the year 1200 until modern times. And of course, that period would be the Native American period that most Americans and modern people are likely most familiar with. We will cover each of these in turn, beginning with the Lithic period and early Archaic in this episode. Not only will this give you a deeper understanding of the history of Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania, but you will view the history of Native Americans in general in a totally different light. I know I do now. Their cultures did not begin with the arrival of Europeans. It goes back 18,000 years and is extremely fascinating in and of itself. Now, according to experts, the Paleo Indians from the Lithic period lived a hunting and gathering lifestyle. These were small nomadic bands who moved from area to area, living off the land and hunting the local game. These people, at least according to the archaeological record, didn't show super distinct cultural markers just yet. And when I say that, I'm talking about things such as artwork and or organized towns or rituals that we can identify. Those are very distinct cultural markers. These people still certainly had a culture. We just don't know too much about it outside of their tools and the way they lived their life. And this was still very complex in a lot of different ways. So these people would hunt white-tailed deer and caribou, which used to exist in North America. They'd also forage for nuts, berries, and other edible items that occupied the land. The deglaciation of the areas in western Pennsylvania, it saw a burst in the diversity and abundance of many plants. So it allowed foraging and gathering to greatly supplement the diet of deer and wild game, which I will elaborate more on shortly about how hunting was really central, and then it appears the foraging and gathering became more popular, let's say, over time. Lithic period peoples also used a wide variety of stone points and improvised tools. Stone spear points were used. Also, scrapers were used for the processing of animal hides, along with knives for cutting, axes for woodwork. Stone bowls or mortars were also used, along with stone pestles, in order to smash and grind various plants. Soon after the melting of the glacier, so in the early lithic period, the climates in western Pennsylvania were also significantly cold because, as stated in previous episodes, the glaciers were still moving back 18,000 years ago. If the people came over the Bering Land Bridge 20,000 years ago or before, much of North America was still covered with a glacier, and the areas close to the glacier would have been cold. It was still a very cold period. So processing animal skins and the tools associated with that were very important to these people, and the area was still very wooded, even though it would have been fresh trees, etc. Now, archaeologists have found about 18 Paleo Indian sites in the Monongahela River Basin, which is the Pittsburgh area. This covers modern day Pittsburgh, but also parts of southern Allegheny County, Washington County, Westmoreland County, Fayette, Somerset, and Greene. Now, I'm unsure if Meadowcroft is included in this list that I'm showing you, but I believe that it is, and if it isn't, it should be because it's also in southern Pennsylvania. The stone points and items found at these sites include many of the above items. These sites indicate people lived in nuclear families, small nomadic bands. One interesting find is that some of this stone was quarried as far away as Ohio and also western New York State. This indicates either a large range of travel for these groups or trade with other nearby groups. And, I really love doing these episodes, covering ancient peoples, because while we don't have that much of the culture or the art, I still put these images in my mind, right? These pictures where, for instance, downtown Pittsburgh, an area that I've known my entire life, which is now covered with buildings and various parks and trees. It's very beautiful to look at. But I like to go back in time, say to this period. Imagine the point where the three rivers met, all of that area being covered entirely with trees. The north side of Pittsburgh across the Allegheny River entirely covered in trees. The south end of Pittsburgh, where Mount Washington exists, entirely covered in trees on the bank of the Monongahela River. And I picture different people living on these different parts of the river, fires being stoked at night, and then during the day, boats moving across the rivers as they engage in trade, etc. It's just a very romantic thought in my mind. Life was very difficult back then, but there's a romantic part of it as well. So in sum, the lithic period was characterized by small bands, advanced hunting and gathering, an emphasis on tools for survival. And these tools were very advanced, in dealing with the cold weather was paramount. Now, we move into the early Archaic stage from 10,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago. As the lithic period's defined by this small band nature, the early Archaic is defined by a warming temperature in the Americas. With this warming, a greater complexity is developed by the Paleo Indians. The population of the density of the people begins to grow, and so the people still live largely nomadic lifestyles, but their groups are larger. With this complexity, the early Archaic people begin to create a larger variety of tools, knives, drills, choppers, scrapers, hammerstones. Of significant note is the discovery of stone pointed projectiles in this period. Now, earlier spear points indicate that these carved points were used for notching to the end of a spear. So most earlier Paleo Indian spearheads had notches. However, in the early Archaic, we see the development of fluted spear points. And this is a smoother, non notched spearhead. And many archaeologists believe this indicates the use of ATLATLs or spear throwers, which would be a significant advancement. Now, it's widely believed, if you read the literature, that bows and arrows came over with the people who crossed the Bering Strait, and possibly ATLATLs did too. But it's unknown when their use began to be widespread amongst these peoples. And you don't see the ATLATL or these spear points, which they believe were used with ATLATLs, until the early Archaic period. And if you don't know what an ATLATL is, I will forgive you. It is a type of spear throwing device. It is believed these spears were used for, these spearheads are used for throwing. And although spears were used for throwing, the ATLATL provides certain advantages. It can be thrown at a much higher rate. The ATLATL also appears to predate the widespread use of the bow and arrow in the Americas. And this ATLATL, it looks kind of weird and awkward shape, but I can assure you, it allows a thrower to launch a spear with deadly velocity and accuracy, used, of course, in hunting, but also possibly in warfare. The early Archaic saw the size of the nomadic bands increase. Not in a hugely significant way. Minor population increase, minor increase in group size from the Lithic period. And the lifestyle was still similar to the Lithic peoples. But again, we do see an increase in size. We do see advanced complexity in tools, but the people are still living, hunting, gathering, moving from place to place. Very few permanent settlements. Now, in other areas of the Americas, including the American South, some permanent settlements begin to arise in this period. But in the Northeast, the Western Pennsylvania area, the Archaic humans are still living off the land, moving from place to place. Another important and interesting point to speak about in regards to the Lithic and the early Archaic is during this period of time, from about 18,000 years ago to around 12,500 years ago, historians often refer to a concept known as overkill. This theory states that Paleo Americans who crossed into the Americas encountered megafauna such as woolly mammoths, massive bison, ground sloths. These animals no longer exist in North America, right? Or South America. They were hunted to extinction. These large animals were not adapted to survival alongside humans. Thus, humans quickly hunted them to extinction, rapidly moving across the North and South American continent in the process. The theory is that such large animals made it easier for these groups to move across large areas because the hunting was easy and prolific. And think about it, if you're moving into an area where there's no humans to compete with, and there's also these massive animals that you can hunt, get huge amounts of protein, energy from animal skins, it certainly makes life easier, makes mobility easier. And the theory is that these large animals, they just made it easier to move across large areas of land. And that's how the Americas were basically loaded with people in a very short period of time once they start crossing the Bering Strait 20,000, 18,000 years ago. Within a few hundred or thousand years, all of North America and South America is occupied with humans. This is simply one theory. It does explain how people move so quickly to places like Meadowcroft not too long after crossing into the Americas. It's not absolutely accepted view of the archaeological community, but it's a very interesting one. And when it comes to the megafauna, there is no evidence of megafauna mammoths being consumed at Meadowcroft, but caribou, elk, other large game are present there. This is very, very interesting, this overkill theory, and it is believed at one time these megafauna existed as far east as places like Pennsylvania. So the larger populations and more advanced stone technology of the Archaic period, it does portend more advanced societies and people groups in the future. So we will see in the next episode, during the middle and later Archaic, humans in western Pennsylvania begin to settle down into more permanent settlements. Farming practices are adopted, technology advances, and more distinct and identifiable human cultures begin to form. So join me for the next exciting episode. Remember to like, subscribe, comment, and share. Check me out on Patreon as well if you would like to donate to the show. Thank yins very much. All right, goodbye. I hope you enjoyed this episode. See you next time.